Hi everyone. This week's teaching assistant is Molly. We haven't seen Molly until now because Molly's usually hiding from the kittens. She hates them because they're too exuberant. She's a little old lady who likes her peace and quiet, and they're the opposite of peace and quiet. Okay, so this week we are covering the last of the social work theories that we cover in this class. If you'll remember, last week we covered these five, and this week we're going to cover critical theory, otherwise known as critical social theory. So this is a big one. That's why we're going to spend the entire lecture on it. So basically, this theory challenges positive assumptions. So positivism is the ideology that you can know reality, you can know truth. So critical theory argues that no, you can't know reality or truth because there's differences in power between individuals. So your truth is going to be very different from somebody else's truth who has a different amount of power. So by doing this, we draw attention to the structural arrangements that create these differences in power and differentiation between dominant groups and subordinate groups. And part of critical theory also argues that people's consciousness and everyday experience in the world are shaped by structural forces, these outside forces. So that shapes their reality and how they then interpret the world. Within critical theory, knowledge is power. Once you become aware of these dominant forces that are keeping you oppressed, you can then act on it. That's the whole point of critical theory. It's very much about challenging existing oppressions, and they argue that once large groups of these subordinate populations become aware that they're being oppressed and subordinated by another group, they will then act against it and seek increases in their power and a fair distribution of resources. So there's very much a political goal of this theory in that it's all about action. And one of the ways that this action is brought forward is by challenging these master narratives, so our accepted views of how things are in this world. So to understand critical theory, we're going to cover some major concepts, including hegemony, discourse, habitus, narratives, and globalization, and how they either contribute to or prevent people from realizing that they are being oppressed. And then we look at several different branches within critical theory, which has expanded to include feminist critical theory, queer theory, critical race theory, etc. So we can't talk about critical theory without discussing Antonio Gramsci. You'll remember him from last week. So he was imprisoned for a vast majority of his life due to his beliefs that political forces and market forces benefit only the ruling class, and that the beliefs, explanations, perceptions, that dominant ideology of society, also known as cultural hegemony, reflects that of the ruling class, not of the working class. Therefore, the social, political, and economic status quo is seen as natural and inevitable, as opposed to something that is socially constructed and very much harming a large part of the population. So the way that hegemony perpetuates is by this received common sense. So we view social problems as a way that has been taught to us. And our words and actions support these structured inequalities. And the social service systems themselves also support and maintain these structures of race and class and privilege. And social workers have been very much complicit in this. For instance, we've talked about the Indian Adoption Project, how the Native American way of life was savage, barbaric, and that Indian children could be freed if they were just adopted into white families, and the Indian was beat out of the child. So we, with critical theory, argue that we need to challenge what is being accepted as common sense, think critically about it, and come up with new versions of what is common and new explanations for social problems in society. For instance, think about healthcare in the US. Right now, the accepted common sense is a market-based model of healthcare and mental health care. So people receive the care they can afford as opposed to the care that they need, because healthcare and healthcare needs are not framed as a human right. They are framed as an individual need, that individual responsibility. So one of the ways that we challenge these common sense assumptions is through discourse. So this is where we recognize that language is a medium of social power. And power is the ability to take one's place in whatever discourse is essential to action, and the right to have one's part matter. That's a quote by Carolyn Hilbrun, who for her entire career struggled to get women recognized in academia as legitimate theorists and professionals. So with discourses, we try to um, change how language is currently used or how social problems are currently described in order to influence systems of practice. So consider some of the language that's used within the social services organizations that you work in or have gone to for services. Consider how the language can exclude service users from the conversation. Um, so one example is something as simple as case management, for instance, and referring to families as cases. You're dehumanizing them. You are um, deconstructing them from an autonomous family unit capable of making their own decisions to just a folder with their name on it that you as the professional can discuss with your supervisor and make decisions on without necessarily including them in those decisions. That's why we've moved towards more inclusive language such as service users or clients. Um, And we can also see that when we look at language taking on the particular power to name a client or frame a problem. With the Indian Adoption Project, again, for instance, it was an adoption project. Sounds very positive and not at all harmful, right? And now we are rightfully calling it cultural genocide. You can see that by reframing the issue, we have a very different understanding of what happened at that time. Another component of critical theory is brought to us by Bourdieu, which is habitus. So habitus occurs when all of these processes that we are exposed to in our daily lives are internalized, and they become our habits and our tastes and dispositions and skills. So all of our social and cultural experiences basically create the person that we become through this internalization process. And then we start accepting things as natural and things that go without saying. So, for instance, you might have grown up in the South where very spicy food is commonly accepted, and then you tried offering the same thing to somebody from the North, and they end up having a very different experience of your culinary skills. That's one very minor example. More severe ones, however, can occur within our professional practice, where we can make assumptions about our clients and their problems that can be faulty or problematic. So, for instance, if we grew up within a heavily individual-oriented household where the responsibility for one's care was dependent on the individual, we might have a different understanding of poverty and homelessness than if we grew up in a house or a community where um, community care and individuals taking care of each other and having a social responsibility towards each other was the norm. The important thing to remember, though, is that habitus is not a deterministic concept. So just because you have internalized these habits and social mores does not mean that you always have to apply them. You can change them by engaging in critical reflexivity to recognize what assumptions you are making and what um, seems natural to you or goes without saying. And one of the ways that we do that is through narrative deconstruction. So a narrative is how stories develop, what stories get told and what gets left out. That's the way that we construct the meaning of complex social contexts where there's relations of power um, and silencing. So the powerful have their voices heard, the powerless are silenced, and their narratives are distorted. However, by engaging in critical dialogue, we can deconstruct, so we can take apart these existing narratives and reconstruct new narratives that are based on hope and liberation. So, one example would be the current deconstruction of gender and the growing recognition that gender is a social construction. It is not a natural biological fact. It is very much socially constructed, and we can change and shape what gender means within society. So think about your practicum experience or your experience with social services. What are some of the dominant stories used to explain why problems exist? So, for instance, high jobless rate right now during COVID, um, how are people explaining about why that's happening? Is it because of the low wages? Is it the poor working conditions? Or is it that people are saying that people are lazy and they'd rather depend on the government? What is the dominant narrative that you are hearing within your organization or within your community? So, what happens when someone presents a story that challenges or inconsistent with the dominant narrative? Are they ignored? Are they ridiculed? Are they silenced? Or is there opportunity to engage in discourse and start to change that dominant narrative? So another critical component of critical theory is globalization. So it's the recognition that at this point in society, everything is impacted by forces outside the US. So the way people around the world have become more connected politically, economically, and socially, which has resulted in flows and disruptions of people, ideas, culture, politics, but it's also resulted in growing inequality and the concentration of power within certain um, classes of people. So, one of the commonly given examples is migration now for people looking for better work and the migrant crisis that happened within Europe. So one way that that narrative is formed is people seeking better employment opportunities. Another way that that narrative can be formed is that the NATO and US led um, conflicts within Africa and the Middle East have resulted in an economic crisis within those regions, and that has resulted in the migration of people we are seeing right now. Very tightly connected to neoliberal or globalization is neoliberalism. So this is the logic of market rule on a global scale. What it means basically is that the market should be free to function without any government restrictions, so that market-based interests can be upheld. It calls for a limiting in the role of the state. However, what critical theorists argue is that the state doesn't just have a limited role in controlling the market, it also facilitates neoliberalism by limiting barriers to it, such as removing safety standards, removing environmental protections, and removing workers' rights to organize. And we actually saw this in Michigan almost 10 years ago now, when Michigan tried to outlaw unions within the state. Critical theorists also argue that the state plays an active social control role, where they use coercive policies and practices, such as surveillance power and the expansion of immigration enforcement and the continued growth of the prison system, to prevent people from pushing back against neoliberalism and the increased role of market forces. So think about how neoliberalism and neoliberal logic might be working within your agency or your community. Have you seen previously not-for-profit organizations, for instance, become private and for-profit? Or for another example, look at the access to medication. We continue to see certain life-saving medication continue to increase in price without any limits from the state. Insulin, for instance, costs hundreds of times more in the US than it does in any other democratic country because of this lack of state or government restrictions on market forces. All right, let's look now at a few of the ways that critical theory has been expanded from its roots to focus on specific oppressions. So feminists developed what's known as feminist critical theory, and it's focused on the workings of patriarchy and the recognition of patriarchy in systematically structuring women's subordination within both family and society. Think about how you see this play out within your own organization, for instance, or within social work as a whole. We've talked before about how social work, as very much a woman-dominated profession, tends to make less money than similar helping professions doing similar work. And even within social work, women get paid less than men. So this is that devaluation of women's work, and the um, feminist critical theory seeks to highlight this problem exists and tries to address it. And as a reminder, the United States still hasn't passed the Equal Rights Amendment, giving men and women equal rights within the Constitution. Next, we've got intersectionality and critical race theory. So intersectionality we've touched on before. It's the power of intersecting forms of oppression based on gender, race, ethnicity, class, etc., and recognizing that people are impacted by many different sources of oppression instead of usually just one. In critical race theory is the interdisciplinary framework and movement that really focuses on understanding the dynamics of race, racism, and power within the United States. The reason that critical race theory has seen so much backlash within the United States is because very few people actually understand what it is, especially the ones protesting against it. This picture here is from a sign at parent-teacher meeting at a school in Tennessee. Parents' poster reads, "Stop teaching racism," because that's what they view critical race theory as. Instead, critical race theory does not teach people racism. It teaches people that racism exists within the United States and has for a very long time. It also teaches them that race is a social construction and that racism serves the material interests of the white elites and the psychic interests of working class whites. So we see that here with this protest. People feel, white people feel better about themselves and a lot more comfortable if they don't recognize the ways in which white supremacy personally benefits them. It's a very uncomfortable feeling to think that you're doing well in life because other people are not. So they very much do not want to confront this feeling and instead argue for banning critical race theory. And one of the last ones that we'll talk about is queer theory and transgender critical theory. There's many others as well, but these are the last two that we have time to focus on today. So queer theory has challenged the binary categories of what it means to be male or female, or that we need to even name and locate people based on their gender. And then transgender theory has emerged from both feminism and queer theory to explore these intersecting social identities and how um, not only is gender identity contextualized and socially constructed, but it's also internalized, which then can impact how you react to others saying, I want to use they, them pronouns. So if your internalized idea of what it means to be male or female does not recognize they, them as a pronoun, you end up pushing back against this and really need to think critically about this internalized um, message that you've received and determine is your um, growth towards using they, them as a pronoun so challenging that you can't recognize other people's um, right to define themselves and move past the heteronormative worldview that we have accepted as standard for so long. So think about your own social work practice. Is your organization centered on that male-female binary structure, or does it allow for other genders to be included? Is it very much heteronormative in what it allows family structures to look like? For instance, are the needs of LGBTQ parents addressed or not? These are some critical questions that we need to consider as we work to understanding how the organizations that we work in are contributing or fighting against the oppression of vulnerable groups.